Have you ever wondered what happens when you're the only one who speaks up? When you see something terrible about to happen and the entire world around you just looks down and stays silent? In today's episode of True Reddit Reads, you'll hear a true story about a young nurse who discovered that the lead surgeon was drunk right before a 12-year-old girl's open heart surgery. And when she chose not to stay silent, the hospital did something no one expected. They didn't fire the doctor. They tried to destroy her. From false accusations, edited security footage, to the shocking turn that put the hospital's CEO and the surgeon behind bars and turned her into a symbol of change in the medical world. This is a story of courage, of fear, of isolation, and in the end, of justice. And if you've ever thought I'm not big enough to change anything, stay until the end, because this story isn't just about her, it just might be about you. Chapter 1: The Fateful Surgery and a Horrifying Discovery. I don't think I'll ever forget that morning. The first procedure of the day was open heart surgery. Our patient was a 12-year-old girl. She was frail and pale, but still tried to smile at her mother as she was wheeled into pre-op. They held hands, like they couldn't bear to let go. And I thought to myself, I'll do everything I can to make sure this little girl gets to go home. We, the nurses, were prepping in the OR when the door suddenly swung open, and then he walked in, Dr. Okafor, lead surgeon, the man who would be making the first incision into that girl's chest in just 20 minutes. His eyes were bloodshot, unfocused, and the smell unmistakable. It wasn't disinfectant, it wasn't medication, it was alcohol, strong, pungent, so overpowering it made me nauseous. Everyone around me looked down, pretending not to see. No one said a word, no one dared, but I couldn't just stand there. I stripped off my gloves and walked straight out, my heart pounding in my chest. I went looking for Dr. Nakamura, the medical director. I knew she and Okafor went way back. Same med school, their families even vacationed together, but that didn't matter now. A child was about to go under the knife, and the lead surgeon was so drunk he could barely stand. I knocked, walked in, told her everything I saw, the glazed eyes, the shaking hands, the smell of alcohol, the staggering walk. I even begged her just take one look. Just once. She didn't look at me. She didn't say thank you. She just leaned back in her chair and laughed. I still remember exactly what she said. Dr. Okafor brings in millions of dollars a year for this hospital. Why would I risk all that over an accusation with no proof? And frankly, everyone knows you haven't gotten over that little incident last year. Little incident? She was talking about the night Dr. Okafor cornered me in the medication cabinet after a late shift. When he tried to force a kiss on me, when I pushed him away and threatened to report him, and he just laughed, stroked my hair, and walked off. The next day, rumors were everywhere that I had come onto a married doctor, that he had politely rejected me and stayed faithful. Okafor was praised. I was branded the seductress. I stood there trembling, but Nakamura's voice was like a slap. Go back to the OR. And if you tell anyone else this lie, I'll make sure you never work in medicine again. I turned and walked out, seething with fury, tears burning in my eyes. But I still went back to the operating room, not for the hospital, for that girl. When I returned, the anesthesiologist, Yamato, was setting up. She met my eyes, and in that split second, I knew she saw it too. Okafor was not okay. She stayed close to him, her hand discreetly ready to steady him if he stumbled. I pulled Yamato aside. I told her the truth. I begged her to help stop the surgery. Help me save that child's life. But then I saw something that shattered me. The ring on her finger. The same engagement ring Okafor's ex-wife wore for 20 years. Yamato wasn't just a colleague. She was his fiancée. Her voice trembled as she whispered, I know this isn't right, but I'm his fiancée. If I ruin his career, what kind of partner would I be? It felt like a punch to the chest. She wasn't just staying silent. She was preparing the drugs. A small dose of benzodiazepine, I saw her injecting it into Okafor's IV. Why? To calm his trembling hands. To make him appear sober, I stood there frozen as she gently kissed her fingertip and placed it on his shoulder like a silent signal. Then she returned to her post. The table was prepped, and I knew right then that if this didn't stop, it wouldn't just be one life at risk. The truth, the integrity of our profession, and our own consciences would be buried right alongside it. Chapter 2: When the entire hospital turned its back on me. After that surgery, I didn't go home right away. I stayed in the locker room staring at the blood stains still smeared across my shoes. A child's blood. A child who could have been easily saved if we had just done the right thing. The girl survived, technically, but her heart didn't. The surgery failed so badly that now she needed a transplant just to stay alive. An unforeseen surgical complication. That's how Nakamura explained it to the girl's mother. I was just a few steps away when she gently placed a hand on Okafor's shoulder and said, "Tough case. Things like this happen. We'll handle the family." As for us, the nurses, Nakamura had only one thing to say. "I don't need to remind you about confidentiality protocol. Anyone who opens their mouth about what happened will be terminated immediately and could face legal action." I thought I would feel scared, but strangely, all I felt was rage. I left the hospital without a word, but the next morning when I came back, I realized I wasn't the same person anymore. And this hospital, it wasn't the place I once trusted. My shift had been changed. No warning. I showed up at the cardiac unit only to find my name gone from the roster. Instead, I was shuffled to pediatrics, then to the geriatric ward, then to emergency every day, a different department. No one knew what was going on. Every shift led, I asked, just shrugged, "I didn't request you." Then came the key card. Suddenly it wouldn't open doors. The med room wouldn't recognize my fingerprint. The computers froze every time I tried to log in, and when I attempted to access the patient file to record the incident from the day before, the screen went black with the words "unauthorized access, recorded." People around me began to disappear. Not literally, but in that way where every time I entered the break room, they walked out. When I needed backup, they were busy. When I asked for the handover reports, they'd whisper something to each other and vanish. The co-workers I had eaten lunch with for 3 years, they now silently took the other elevator. I started eating lunch alone in the parking garage, and of course the rumors began. At first it was quiet whispers. Heard she drinks before shifts. Then she's been warned multiple times for addiction. Finally, she's blaming Okafor because she's under investigation. Someone left an AA pamphlet in my locker. Another taped a substance abuse hotline to my windshield. My shifts got heavier. Critical patients, severely demented seniors, post-op emergencies, patients requiring full-body PPE. Everyone else got one, I got four. Every single day. My back started to ache, my legs throbbed, my mind felt like a wire pulled taut. And then I noticed chart tampering. Notes I had written gone, notes I never wrote showing up under my name. One day, I saw in the system a report saying I had administered the wrong dosage to a patient I had never even cared for. When I asked the head nurse, she simply said, "You probably forgot." It didn't see anything unusual. I knew something was very, very wrong. I went home, sat silently in front of a cold cup of coffee, and told everything to my mom, a lawyer who specializes in family law. She listened, took notes, and said nothing until she made 3 back-to-back phone calls. Her voice was calm, but I could see her knuckles turning white from gripping her pen. Then she looked at me and said, "I know a few people in medical malpractice litigation, and the girl's mother, she's already contacted a major firm. They're building a case, and they want you as their key witness." I swallowed hard. I didn't know if I should be scared or hopeful. "But you need evidence," she said, "and their system's playing dirty." She handed me a notebook and said, "Write down everything. By hand. Every time your keycard fails. Every time you're overloaded with patients. Every threat. Every hostile stare." I started the next morning. I arrived early, stood outside the cardiac unit, and my keycard didn't work. When the security guard opened the door, I logged the time his name, assigned 4 patients, while others had 2, logged. That morning's meeting, Nakamura walked in, which she never does, and stared me down, while talking about staff, showing signs of psychological instability, logged. When I went back to the break room, my locker was wide open, my belongings soaked in spilled coffee, books ripped. My stethoscope, a graduation gift from my mom, was missing. Security cameras under maintenance. I wrote it all down, and I knew this was just the beginning. They were trying to break me before I could tell the truth. But this time I wasn't alone. I had my mother. I had my notebook. And I had the truth. Chapter 3. They wanted to break me. Piece by piece. You think the worst thing is being talked about behind your back. The worst is when they try to systematically crush you quietly, step by step in every tiny detail until you start thinking you're the one at fault. After the shift changes the dirty rumors and the stolen stethoscope, I thought things couldn't get any worse. But then they got smarter. Every time I approached the med room, Yamoto was already there. She wouldn't say anything, just stood there with her arms crossed, staring at me like I was some nursing student waiting to be caught in a mistake. One time while I was prepping meds for a patient, she suddenly asked, "What are you injecting?" And why that dosage, I answered calmly, step by step, every directive, every milligram, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She wanted me to mess up. Night shifts were even worse. I found my tires deflated not once, but twice in a single week. The security guard said it might be cold air reducing pressure. Sure. Both nights had been warm, and only my car was affected. Then came the strange phone calls. At night, the nurse station phone would ring. When I picked up, silence, long enough for me to think the line had dropped. Then, click, they hung up. Once I came out to the parking lot and found a photograph under my windshield wiper. A picture of my apartment. No note, no words. Just a glossy high-res image. Someone had stood outside my building and taken it. From that night on, I started taking different routes home. Sometimes circling 3 blocks. Sometimes stopping at a gas station for no reason. I bought a doorbell camera. The first night it was installed, I got a motion alert at 3 a.m. The image was blurry but unmistakable, a person in scrubs standing in front of my door for nearly 3 minutes, then walking away. No ringing the bell, no movement, just standing there. I sent the footage to my mom. She stayed silent for a moment, then said, "They want you scared enough to quit." I didn't quit, and I wasn't completely alone anymore. An old friend, Sarah, an ICU nurse, started bringing her lunch out to the parking lot to sit with me. She didn't say much, but her presence was its own form of support. Tom, an ER nurse, accidentally left a stack of papers on the break room table while I was there. First page highlighted in yellow, whistleblower protection policy. I started seeing them. The silent ones who hadn't turned away. People who weren't ready to speak up, but also weren't willing to abandon me. But on the other side, they didn't let up either. At one morning briefing, Okafor showed up again. First time I'd seen him since the girl's surgery. His eyes were clearer than usual, but his breath told a different story. I could smell the alcohol again right there in the daylight. He walked up to me, voice casual like we were chatting at a cafe. "Heard you've been having some computer issues? It's the worst, huh? But good nurses focus on patients, not problems." He stood so close I could smell the cologne mixed with whiskey. I didn't answer. My hands kept calmly drawing insulin, double-checking the dose. When he left, I looked at the clock, logged the time, his exact words, and the name of the charge nurse nearby who was close enough to hear. Every time they approached me, I responded with documentation. I had become their nightmare because I didn't fight back with emotions. I fought with evidence. My mom's lawyer, Patricia Chen, began contacting me regularly. She asked for every single file. I had photos, journal entries, screenshots. They were building a case, not just about the surgery, about the entire system of retaliation. And then came my performance review. Every year I was ranked excellent. This year, uncooperative, poor interpersonal skills, defiant toward leadership. I'd never seen this evaluation before it had been sent directly to HR. A few days later, I received a letter from the state nursing board. They were reviewing my license renewal due to a report questioning professional competence. No details, no evidence, just another crack. Another fault line they hoped would shatter me. I called my mom. She immediately found me a lawyer who specialized in license defense. I sat alone in my half-empty apartment, having sold off furniture just to make rent, surrounded by stacks of folders, notebooks, photos, notes, and printed emails. I had lost coworkers, lost my reputation, even lost the feeling of safety in my own home. And I knew this wasn't rock bottom yet, but I also knew I wasn't backing down. Not because I was braver than anyone else, but because I had seen a child's blood spill across an OR floor and knew with every fiber of my being, if I don't stand up, then who will? Chapter 4. Turning the Tide. When the girl's mother took action, I used to think the healthcare system was immovable. A massive machine, where if you were just a nurse, a tiny cog, you only had two choices. Stay silent and keep turning or make noise. And get spit out. I chose to make noise. And just as expected, they tried to crush me. But what I didn't know was that there was a larger cog turning in the opposite direction. And that cog was the mother of the 12-year-old girl on the operating table that day. I didn't know who she was until the day I received a legal packet delivered to my apartment. On top was a small, handwritten note. Thank you for trying. Please be my witness. At first, I didn't understand. But just a few phone calls later, it all became clear she wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a senior partner at one of the biggest medical malpractice law firms in the state. And she had seen everything through the glass wall of the OR. She saw her daughter lose blood. She saw us struggle to save that fragile life while the lead surgeon trembled from being drunk. She didn't scream. She didn't lash out. She filed a lawsuit. And she didn't just go after Okafor, she went after the entire system that allowed it to happen. Everything moved fast after that. Her law firm launched an investigation. They issued subpoenas, requested preservation of surveillance footage, called for internal documents. I couldn't stop the flicker of satisfaction I felt each time Nakamura's name popped up in the legal paperwork. But at the same time, I knew the retaliation would get worse. And of course it did. The hospital was furious. My work schedule turned into a logistical nightmare. ER one day, inpatient ward the next, then accidentally assigned to departments where no one knew I was even coming. When I called to confirm shifts, they said, "You're not on the schedule." My keycard kept malfunctioning. This time I couldn't even access the staff restrooms. I had to ask a security guard to unlock the bathroom. That humiliation was no accident. One evening I came in for a night shift and found my break room flooded with coffee. My documents were soaked, some pages unreadable. My locker was completely emptied, even the spare shoes I kept there were gone. Security. Sorry, the camera system is undergoing maintenance today. I didn't say a word. I just took out my phone and photographed everything. Every coffee stain. Every drenched sheet. I taped a printed sign to my locker door in bold letters, "I will not stay silent," and I have backups of everything. From that moment, I shifted my strategy. I didn't just take notes, I started looking for allies. Sarah, the one who had lunch with me every day, began asking more questions. One day she said, "You're not the first you know. Someone else tried to report Okafor before, a nurse named Catherine. But later, they forced her to resign for excessive absenteeism. They fabricated her file to get rid of her. I found Catherine, and then Sebastian, and then Maria. Each had a story, a scar, but the pattern was the same. They had spoken up, and then they had been crushed. Some lost their jobs. Some lost their careers entirely. Catherine. She had been hospitalized for depression after being fired on false grounds. I spoke with them, recorded their accounts, handed them over to the girl's mother's legal team, and slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together. We weren't isolated incidents. We were a chain of victims in a system that knew it was wrong, but chose silence for the sake of profit. Patricia Chen, the attorney representing the lawsuit, began calling me more frequently. We met in my mother's office, now stacked with files, spreadsheets, and evidence. One day, she said bluntly, "We may be able to escalate this from a personal suit to a class action lawsuit." I sat there gripping my water glass, my heart torn between excitement and dread. I was a nurse, not a warrior, but when I closed my eyes, I still saw blood on the OR floor, still heard that mother sobbing through the glass, and I knew if I didn't do this, no one else would. They had pushed me to the edge. Now it was my turn to drag them into the light. Chapter 5: The Silent Army. When the quiet ones finally spoke, I used to think I was just a nurse, just one person, a tiny name in a massive hospital within a system that felt invincible. But then other names started surfacing, not because I called them, but because they saw I hadn't fallen, and that gave them hope. Catherine was the first to step forward and submit a sworn affidavit. She had once been the head nurse, the one who wrote a letter to leadership about Okafor 3 years ago. That letter was lost internally. 3 weeks later, she was accused of forging signatures, though no evidence was ever presented. She lost her job, lost her license, and nearly lost her sanity. When I called, Catherine hesitated for a long time before answering. "Are you sure that this time someone will actually listen?" I didn't reply with words. I sent her a list of nurses who had worked in my department, those who had agreed to support the lawsuit, even if anonymously. 13 names, and the number kept growing. Sebastian, an anesthesia tech, sent me a short video. In it, Okafor was in the break room cracking open a bottle of liquor in full surgical gear. Not the day of the girl's surgery, Sebastian said, but not long after. I asked why he hadn't gone public with it sooner. "Because I've got student loans, my wife's pregnant, and I don't want to be dragged into the mud." A painful truth, but a real one. I understood. Not everyone can be the one holding the flag, but sometimes they just need to see someone who is. And then Maria, a janitorial staff member often dismissed as unimportant, sent me photos from her personal phone, a cleaning log that had been manually altered, old medication receipts with doctor names scratched out, and a small bag with mini liquor bottles stuffed under the chief surgeon's break room cabinet. Maria didn't say much. She simply messaged, "You're the first person who ever asked if I noticed anything strange. You'd be surprised how many people witness wrongdoing. But stay silent simply because no one ever asked." The law firm representing the girl's mother didn't just gather evidence, they started connecting the victims, building profiles, linking patterns, and then they discovered something none of us expected. A total of over 20 internal complaints had been filed to the hospital board about Okafor in the past 5 years, and all of them had vanished. No responses, no follow-ups, no disciplinary records. I still remember how it felt hearing that number, like realizing the monster we were fighting wasn't just one man. It was an entire rotten ecosystem fed by fear. One day, while preparing my testimony documents, I ran into Thomas, my preceptor, back when I first started nursing. I expected him to avoid me like so many others had, but instead of dodging me, he sat down across from me in the hospital cafe and pulled out a brown envelope. Inside was a printed email from 4 years ago. Subject line: concerns about Dr. Okafor's behavior during March 12th surgery. Sender Thomas. Recipient Nakamura. No reply. "You never deleted this," I said, "because I knew someday someone would need it." He answered, then stood up and walked away. No thanks needed. I was no longer alone. And then came a moment I'll never forget for the rest of my life. On a Monday morning, I walked into the hospital like any other day. But unlike other days, everyone was looking at me. Not with judgment, not with suspicion, but with the look of someone who knows, who had been right all along. At the front desk, I saw a public notice posted: Dr. Okafor, temporarily suspended. Internal investigation ongoing. Beneath it, was the signature of the acting CEO, not Nakamura, because 3 days earlier, he had been arrested. Charges suppression of evidence, abuse of authority, and destruction of internal records. That morning, as I held my coffee cup, my hands didn't shake anymore. I smiled. A small smile, not wide, but deep. Not because we'd won. There was still a mountain of work ahead. But because for the first time in months I didn't have to whisper anymore. And I wasn't afraid. Chapter 6. The Trial. The verdict and a message to anyone standing alone. Court isn't like what you see on TV. There are no dramatic outbursts, no pounding fists, no intense soundtrack, and certainly no scenes where the lawyer yells objection and the whole courtroom gasps. In reality, it was eerily quiet. For 3 straight days, I sat on the witness stand, recounting everything from the beginning. From Okafor's glazed-over eyes the morning he entered the OR to the times my keycard was accidentally deactivated, my schedule erased, and the false accusation that I stole medication. The hospital's attorney tried to twist every detail. There's camera footage showing you taking the meds. I replied, that camera was installed 3 days after I was suspended. And the date on that footage, it was a day I wasn't even scheduled to work. I remember one moment clearly, the judge, a silver-haired, middle-aged woman, paused, lowered her glasses, and stared directly at the hospital's attorney. She said nothing. That silence said more than any ruling ever could. On the 4th day, the girl's mother, the woman who had started all of this, took the stand. She spoke slowly, firmly. My daughter had heart surgery performed by someone reeking of alcohol, and she wouldn't have had to endure what she did if someone in this system had listened from the very first warning. The courtroom fell completely still. The air turned heavy, as if every word was a silent accusation shouted without volume. Then came the others. Catherine, Maria, Sebastian, one by one they spoke. Those once dismissed as troublemakers were now the most credible witnesses in the room. Finally, when it was time for the hospital's closing remarks, they had nothing to offer but a pre-written apology full of empty words. And then the verdict was delivered. Okafor, his medical license permanently revoked, criminally charged with practicing under the influence and falsifying medical records, sentenced to 7 years in prison. Nakamura, the former CEO, sentenced to 5 years for destroying evidence and covering up the dangerous actions of a doctor under her leadership. The hospital was ordered to pay nearly $20 million in compensation to the victims, covering reputational restoration, emotional damages, and legal fees for those who had been wrongfully retaliated against. And me, my name was cleared. I was offered to return to the hospital this time in a senior role overseeing professional ethics and compliance. I declined, not because I was afraid, but because I had chosen a different path to train young nurses how to speak up without being crushed. Now I travel to nursing schools, community hospitals, and host small workshops where I tell this story. No exaggeration, no sugarcoating, no hiding. I just tell the truth. And I show them that sometimes all it takes is one person standing tall to shake an entire system. Once after a talk, a young nursing student came up to me, eyes welling with tears. You made me believe that I don't have to choose between ethics and my career. I hugged her tightly, then said, you don't have to choose. If the system forces you to choose, then you have the right to change it. Now, when I look back, I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I'm living proof that whispered warnings in hospital hallways, if truly heard, can save a life. That sometimes a person who stands alone, not to be a hero, but simply because they can't stay silent any longer, is the first step toward pulling an entire machine back on course. And if you're watching this video and you're standing where I once stood, threatened, isolated, labeled as trouble just for doing what's right, then please remember I see you, I believe you, and you are not alone. Chapter 7. The System Fights Back. When the Department of Health begins reform. I used to think if I stayed quiet, the system would protect me. But after the trial, I realized this. It's because so many people stayed quiet that the system became this rotten in the first place. Just 1 week after the verdict was handed down, I got a call from the State Department of Health. At first, I assumed it was some kind of formal apology or a PR move to clean up the mess, but it wasn't. The person on the line was the director of internal oversight, and the first thing she said to me was, "We can't fix the past, but if you're willing, we'd like you to help change the future." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. They invited me to join the state's Medical Ethics Oversight Committee, a small team responsible for reviewing how internal complaints from nurses, doctors, and medical staff are handled. In simple terms, I, someone who was once suspended, was now going to help oversee how people like me were treated, and I said yes. In those early meetings, I heard stories that were somehow even worse than mine. A nurse who discovered an anesthesiologist forgot to turn off the meds. The patient died on the table. A floor nurse who got fired after reporting a doctor for prescribing the wrong dosage to an elderly patient. A resident who realized patient records had been altered after complications and was reassigned for speaking up. I had heard enough. And for the first time, they heard us, too. I proposed redesigning the anonymous internal complaint system with third-party oversight outside of hospital chains. I pushed for mandatory mental health evaluations for all physicians, especially department heads who worked more than 60 hours per week, because exhaustion and burnout aren't badges of honor. They're landmines waiting to explode. I advocated for an emergency whistleblower hotline for all medical staff where anyone could report misconduct and receive a documented response within 72 hours. Some in the room pushed back. They called it complicated, underfunded, and vulnerable to abuse. I looked at them, straight on. Then I told them the story of the 12-year-old girl who almost died, and how I spent 3 straight months trying to disprove a fake surveillance clip just to prove I didn't steal medication. That is the result of decades of simplicity, cost-cutting, and silence. After that, 3 proposals passed. Partly because of me, partly because they knew they couldn't keep looking away. The press, the public, even the younger doctors were watching closely now. We began reopening over 200 dismissed complaints from the last 5 years. What we found, 37 cases had been deliberately ignored. 9 doctors had repeat violations. 4 hospitals were ordered to restructure their leadership. And then I was no longer the victim. I was part of the change. One day I received an email from a medical resident I'd never met. He wrote, "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I found the courage to report the department head who told me to shut up if I wanted to pass my rotation." I laughed. Not because I was happy, but because, finally, someone wasn't afraid anymore. And if just one person like me can make that happen, how many more would rise if they only knew they weren't alone? Chapter 8. Late Night Calls. When Strangers Beg for Guidance. I used to think that once the trial ended, once the wrongdoers were exposed, I'd finally be left in peace. I was wrong. The truth is, when you become the first person to speak out, you're no longer just a survivor. You become a lighthouse in the fog for others still trying to find their way. In the first week after the hearing, I received over 40 emails. By the second week, I had to create a separate inbox. My main one was practically exploding. They weren't congratulations. They weren't from journalists. They were desperate messages from people who were scared. A nurse from New Mexico wrote, "Sister, my department. Head keeps falling asleep during anesthesia procedures. If I report it, I'll lose my job. But if I don't, someone's going to die someday." A technician in Oregon shared, "I saw a doctor ignore a patient's lung tumor scan. A week later, that patient died. Now I'm being threatened with a lawsuit for spreading misinformation." There was even a young doctor fresh out of med school, a first-year resident who called me at 3 a.m. just to ask, How did you know it was worth risking everything to speak out? How did you know you weren't just losing your mind? I sat on my kitchen floor, holding the phone, listening to him sob, and all I could say were three words, because I was too. After that call, I decided to do something small. I drafted a sample complaint form, a checklist on how to gather evidence, and a list of pro bono lawyers who had helped me, then uploaded it all to an anonymous blog. No branding, no manifesto, just one simple title. If you're afraid, start her. A few days later, that page was being shared across dozens of medical communities. A doctor in Florida told me thanks to that checklist, I recorded my department head pressuring me to delete a patient's test results. A nurse in Tennessee wrote, I don't feel alone anymore. Thank you, I still have my job. And my patient is still alive. Over time, I started to see it clearly. My story didn't end in a courtroom. It began again in every message, every shaky voice, just like mine used to be. I'm not a lawyer, not a politician. I'm just a nurse who chose not to look away. And now the ones who once trembled are picking up their recorders. The ones who once stayed silent are starting to file reports. And the hospitals that once felt untouchable are finally being forced to answer. Because something strange is spreading. Courage. Not from those who were born brave, but from those who thought they couldn't be, until they saw someone else dare to go first. Chapter 9. A Letter from a Mother. Why I Will Never Stay Silent Again. I still remember the exact moment I received that letter. It wasn't an email, it wasn't a message, it was a real envelope. Hand-delivered. Sender, Megan V. It took me a few seconds to place the name. She was the mother of the 12-year-old girl, the one who had nearly gone under the knife with a drunk surgeon. I opened the letter, just 3 short paragraphs, but reading them felt like someone was squeezing my heart. I don't even know where to begin. It's just that all this time I kept imagining what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day. If you had been like the others, silent eyes down, and looked the other way. My daughter's 13 now. She recovered well after the surgery with a different doctor, one who was sober and kind. But what brought me to tears wasn't just that she survived. It was that she's no longer afraid of hospitals. She told me, I know there are still good people who wear white coats. And I realized my daughter wasn't just saved physically. She was saved from a lifelong fear of the very system meant to heal her. I must have read that letter 100 times. I used to think justice meant exposing the people who did wrong. I used to think victory was when the court declared me innocent. But then I realized the real victory is when a child dares to trust again. When a mother who nearly lost her child writes to you not to place blame, but to say thank you. I folded the letter and placed it in my nightstand drawer. And every time I feel exhausted from endless committee meetings, every time I see people in this field defend reputations instead of making things right, I take out the letter and read it again. Because that is why I can never afford to stay silent again. Not because I'm brave, not because I want to be a hero, but because if I don't speak up, another child might never wake up from surgery. Because if I stay silent, then how many others will bow their heads, just like I once did? You ask me what helped me move past the fear, it's this. A single sentence from a girl who survived. I know there are still good people who wear white coats. I live to be worthy of that sentence. Chapter 10. When you're the one who stands first and no longer bows your head. I used to be a nurse at the bottom of the ladder, bottom of the system, bottom of the conference room, bottom of every decision made. I know what it feels like to be told, this isn't your place to speak. But today, as I stand at a statewide healthcare reform conference with a nameplate in front of me that reads, Clinical Advisor, Medical Ethics Oversight Committee, I don't feel like I'm at the bottom anymore. I'm leading something, not a title, but a responsibility. I'm not the smartest person in the room, not the most powerful, but I'm the one who saw firsthand what happens when an entire system chooses to look away. And that gives me a strength no degree can teach. A strength forged from being humiliated, having my license suspended, being called a troublemaker. I've stood alone in court, been summoned to security over accusations of stealing medication which never happened. I've been labeled a legal risk, an unstable employee. I used to walk into the hospital feeling like a criminal, but I've also stood mid-shift looking into the eyes of a young girl about to undergo heart surgery and knew if I didn't speak up, she might never wake up. And I chose to speak. Today I teach new nurses how to document everything, how to find a lawyer, how to protect themselves without abandoning their patients. I get emails from people who followed those steps and saved lives. I don't share this to be praised. I share it because maybe you're watching this video and you see something wrong where you are. Maybe you're a nurse, a teacher, a childcare worker, just an ordinary person no one remembers by name. But if you can see what's wrong, maybe you were also born to help fix it. And if you're trembling, if you're scared, if you're thinking, I'm not big enough to make a difference, then remember what that little girl once said. I know there are still good people who wear white coats. Be the first to stand, because you'll never know how many others are just waiting to see you stand so they'll know they can stand too. I once bowed my head, but now I hold it high, not because I won, but because I survived. And I'm not standing alone anymore. You know what's scarier than a deadly mistake? It's when an entire system knows the truth and still chooses silence. She chose not to stay silent, and the price she paid was her reputation, her career, and nearly her entire life. But in return, she saved a little girl. She gave other nurses the courage to stand up. And most importantly, she forced a system that once seemed untouchable to finally answer for its failures. If you're watching this and you see yourself in her, an ordinary person with no power, no protection, but a heart that refuses to back down, then remember you're not alone. And you don't have to be big to start change. You just need to be brave enough to be the first to stand. Thank you for watching one of the most powerful stories we've ever told. If this story made you think, made you feel the weight of injustice, or gave you a spark of courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone else who needs to know that the truth is worth protecting. We'll see you in the next episode of True Reddit Reads, where every story is a battle for justice.